The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ground as the missionary group approached the settlement, nestled in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains. Sister Margaret Whitmore pulled her woolen shawl tighter against the November wind, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp Utah air. Behind her, 5 other missionaries, 3 men and 2 women, sat in weary silence after their month-long journey from Nauvoo. "There it is," called Brother Samuel Hayes from the driver's seat, pointing toward a cluster of log cabins arranged in a perfect semicircle around a larger central building. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, creating a welcoming sight against the stark landscape of Salt Lake Valley. As their wagon rolled into the settlement, doors began to open. Men, women, and children emerged, their faces bright with genuine smiles. Margaret noticed how well-dressed they appeared for such a remote location. The women wore clean, pressed dresses despite the harsh frontier conditions, and the children's faces were scrubbed clean, their hair neatly combed. "Welcome, brothers and sisters." A tall man with graying temples and piercing blue eyes approached their wagon. His voice carried authority, yet warmth. "I am Elias Cowdery, and this is our humble community of Zion's Rest." Odi, Margaret had heard the name Cowdery before. This man claimed to be a distant cousin of Oliver Cowdery, one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. The resemblance was striking, though Elias carried himself with an almost regal bearing that seemed unusual for a frontier patriarch. "We've prepared quarters for you," Elias continued, gesturing towards several smaller cabins. "Sister Cowdery has prepared a feast to celebrate your arrival. We so rarely receive visitors from the outside world." As Margaret climbed down from the wagon, she was immediately surrounded by women offering assistance with her belongings. Their kindness felt overwhelming, almost suffocating. Each woman who spoke to her mentioned how blessed they were to live under Brother Elias's guidance, how he had received special revelations that had made their community prosper even in these harsh conditions. "You'll be staying with Sister Ruth and her daughters," explained a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but an oddly nervous manner. "I'm Sister Mary Cowdery, Elias's wife. We're so grateful for your mission work." Margaret noticed that Mary's smile never quite reached her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. When Margaret tried to make eye contact, Mary quickly looked away, focusing instead on the ground or on Margaret's luggage. The cabin assigned to Margaret was small but immaculately clean. Sister Ruth, a woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair, showed her to a narrow bed near the window. 2 young girls, perhaps 14 and 16, sat quietly in the corner, their eyes downcast. "These are my daughters, Patience and Charity," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll help you with anything you need." Margaret smiled at the girls, but they didn't respond. Their silence felt unnatural, almost fearful. When she tried to engage them in conversation, they exchanged quick glances before Patience, the older one, spoke in a monotone voice. "We are blessed to serve the Lord's chosen servants," she said, the words sounding rehearsed. "Brother Elias teaches us that silence is golden and obedience is divine." That evening, the entire community gathered in the central building for the welcoming feast. Margaret counted nearly 60 people, an impressive number for such an isolated location. The meal was elaborate: roasted venison, fresh bread, preserved fruits, and vegetables that must have been carefully stored from the harvest. Elias sat at the head of the long table, his presence commanding even in silence. When he spoke, every conversation stopped. When he laughed, others laughed. When he grew serious, the entire room fell into respectful quiet. "Brothers and sisters," Elias began, rising to address the gathering, "we are blessed tonight to welcome these faithful servants into our midst. They come from the outside world, where corruption and apostasy run rampant. Here, in our sanctuary, they will witness the pure gospel as it was meant to be lived." Margaret noticed how he emphasized certain words: pure, sanctuary, meant to be lived, as if they carried special meaning for his followers. The community members nodded in unison, their faces reflecting an almost worshipful devotion. "We live by higher laws here," Elias continued, his blue eyes scanning the room. "Laws that have been revealed to me through direct communion with the divine. What the outside world calls sin, we understand as sacred duty. What they call forbidden, we know as blessed commandment." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Something in his tone, in the way the community hung on his every word, felt wrong. She glanced at her fellow missionaries and saw her own unease reflected in their faces. After the meal, as the community dispersed to their homes, Margaret walked back to her cabin with Ruth and her daughters. The November night was bitter cold, and their breath formed ghostly trails in the moonlight. "Sister Ruth," Margaret ventured, "Brother Elias speaks of special revelations. Has he shared these with the church leadership in Nauvoo?" Ruth's step faltered slightly. "Brother Elias receives his revelations directly from God," she replied carefully. "He teaches us that the church leaders in Nauvoo have been corrupted by worldly influences. We are the true remnant, the pure in heart." As they reached the cabin, Margaret noticed that several other buildings still had lights burning, despite the late hour. Shadows moved behind curtained windows, and she could hear the low murmur of voices, though she couldn't make out words. "What happens in those buildings at night?" she asked. Ruth's face went pale in the moonlight. "Prayer meetings," she said quickly. "Brother Elias often receives revelations at night. The chosen ones are called to witness and participate." "The chosen ones?" "Those who have proven their faith through complete obedience." Patience spoke up, her young voice carrying an odd mixture of pride and fear. "Those who understand that God's ways are not man's ways." Inside the cabin, as Margaret prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The walls were thin, and she could hear movement in the adjacent buildings, footsteps, whispered conversations, and occasionally sounds that made her deeply uncomfortable. She knelt beside her bed to pray, as was her custom, but found herself struggling to focus. Instead of peace, she felt a growing sense of dread, as if something dark lurked beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect community. Through her small window, she could see the central building where Elias lived. A warm light glowed from one of the upper windows, and occasionally she glimpsed shadows moving across the curtains. At one point, she was certain she saw the silhouette of a man and what appeared to be a much smaller figure, perhaps a child. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Margaret's last conscious thought was a prayer for protection, though she couldn't yet articulate what she feared she might need protection from. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of muffled crying. She lay still in her narrow bed, listening carefully. The sound seemed to come from somewhere within the cabin, perhaps from the room where Ruth and her daughters slept. She rose quietly and padded barefoot across the cold wooden floor. Through the thin wall that separated the rooms, she could hear Ruth's voice, barely audible, speaking in urgent whispers. "Hush now, Charity. You know better than to make noise. Brother Elias has been patient with your reluctance, but his patience has limits." "Mama, please," came a young voice. "Charity, the 14-year-old. I don't want to go to the special prayers anymore. The things he makes us do, they don't feel holy. Child, you must not question the prophet's revelations. Brother Elias has explained that your earthly understanding is limited. What feels wrong to your natural mind is actually God's highest law." Margaret pressed her ear closer to the wall, her heart racing. The conversation continued in whispers too low to fully comprehend, but the distress in the young girl's voice was unmistakable. When morning came, Margaret joined the community for breakfast in the central building. The atmosphere was cheerful, almost aggressively so. Children laughed and played, women chatted about domestic matters, and men discussed plans for winter preparations. Yet Margaret couldn't shake the memory of what she'd overheard. She studied Charity's face across the room. The girl sat beside her mother, picking at her food. her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. When Elias entered the dining hall, Charity's entire body tensed and she kept her gaze fixed firmly on her plate. "Good morning, faithful saints," Elias announced, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Today, we begin preparing our new missionaries for the deeper truths of our faith. Brother Hayes and Brother Morrison will join me for a discussion of the higher priesthood ordinances." Margaret watched as the two male missionaries nodded eagerly. They had been completely taken in by Elias's charisma and apparent spiritual authority. "Sister Whitmore and Sister Jenkins," Elias continued, his blue eyes settling on Margaret, "will spend the day with our sisters, learning about the sacred roles of women in God's true order." After breakfast, Margaret found herself assigned to help with laundry alongside several of the community women. As they worked by the creek, scrubbing clothes against the rocks, she tried to engage them in conversation about their lives before coming to Zion's rest. "I came here as a young bride," explained Sister Hannah, a woman in her 30s with haunted eyes. "My husband died of fever our first winter. Brother Elias took me into his household, said God had revealed that I was to be sealed to him for eternity." "How many wives does Brother Elias have?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her tone casual. The women exchanged nervous glances. "The Lord's prophets have always practiced celestial marriage," Hannah replied carefully. "Abraham had many wives, Jacob had many wives. Brother Elias follows the ancient pattern. But the church has not officially sanctioned plural marriage," Margaret pointed out. "The church leaders in Nauvoo lack the spiritual maturity to receive certain revelations," said another woman, Sister Rebecca. "Brother Elias has been shown that plural marriage is just the beginning. There are higher laws, more sacred ordinances that prepare us for celestial glory." Margaret felt a chill despite the morning sun. "What kind of higher laws?" The women fell silent, focusing intently on their washing. Finally, Hannah spoke, her voice barely audible above the sound of running water. "Laws that require perfect faith and absolute obedience. Laws that the natural mind cannot comprehend. Brother Elias teaches that God's ways often appear as foolishness to the world, even as sin to those who lack spiritual understanding." That afternoon, Margaret was invited to observe what Elias called a revelation session. Ashway, in the central building's main room, about 20 community members sat in a circle while Elias stood in the center, his eyes closed, swaying slightly. "The Lord speaks to me now," he announced, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "He shows me visions of the celestial kingdom where the faithful will dwell in eternal glory." Margaret watched, fascinated and disturbed, as the community members hung on his every word. Some began to weep, others raised their hands in apparent ecstasy. "The Lord reveals that earthly marriage is but a shadow of celestial union," Elias continued. "In the highest degree of glory, the boundaries between souls dissolve. What the world calls forbidden becomes sacred. What the world calls sin becomes sacrament." He opened his eyes and looked directly at Margaret. "Sister Whitmore, the Lord has shown me that you have been prepared to receive higher truths. Your heart is pure, your faith strong. You will be blessed to witness the sacred ordinances that bind families for eternity." Margaret felt trapped by his gaze, unable to look away. Around her, the community members nodded and murmured their agreement. She managed a weak smile and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. That evening, as she helped Ruth prepare dinner, Margaret tried to probe deeper into the community's practices. "Sister Ruth, when Brother Elias speaks of sacred ordinances, what exactly does he mean?" Ruth's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. "There are things that cannot be spoken of openly," she said finally. "Sacred things that would be misunderstood by those who lack spiritual maturity. But surely, as a fellow missionary, I could understand." "No," Ruth's voice was sharp, almost panicked. "You must not ask such questions." Brother Elias will reveal what you need to know when the time is right. To seek knowledge before you're prepared is dangerous. That night, Margaret lay awake, listening to the sounds of the settlement. Around midnight, she heard footsteps outside her cabin, followed by a soft knock on Ruth's door. She heard whispered conversation, then the sound of the door opening and closing. Unable to resist, Margaret crept to her window and peered out. In the moonlight, she could see Ruth walking toward the central building, her head bowed. She was not alone. Several other women were making the same journey, moving like shadows across the settlement. Margaret watched as they disappeared into the central building. For nearly an hour, she remained at her window, but the women did not emerge. Finally, exhaustion overcame her curiosity, and she returned to bed. But sleep brought no peace. Her dreams were filled with whispered voices, shadowy figures, and the persistent feeling that she was witnessing something fundamentally wrong, something that violated every principle of decency and faith she held dear. When she woke the next morning, Ruth was already up, preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. But Margaret noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands shook as she worked, and the careful way she avoided making eye contact. "Sister Ruth," Margaret said gently, "are you feeling well?" Ruth's smile was brittle, forced. "Of course, Sister Whitmore. I am blessed to serve the Lord in all things. We are all blessed here in Zion's rest." But as Ruth turned away, Margaret caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Dark bruises on Ruth's wrists, partially hidden by her long sleeves, marks that looked suspiciously like rope burns. 3 weeks into their stay, Margaret had grown increasingly disturbed by the undercurrents of life in Zion's rest. The surface remained pristine. Daily prayers, communal meals, industrious work preparing for winter, but beneath lay something that made her skin crawl. She'd begun keeping a journal, carefully documenting her observations. The way certain young women disappeared for days at a time, only to return pale and withdrawn. The way children fell silent whenever Elias approached. The way conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room. On this particular morning, Margaret was assigned to help clean the central building while Elias was away hunting with some of the men. Sister Mary, Elias's first wife, led a group of women through the building with mops and rags. "We must be thorough," Mary instructed, her voice carrying an edge of desperation. "Brother Elias expects perfection in all things, especially in the house of the Lord." Margaret found herself assigned to clean the upper floor, an area she had never been permitted to enter before. As she climbed the narrow wooden stairs, she noticed how the atmosphere seemed to change. The air felt heavier, oppressive, and there was a strange smell, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. The upper floor contained several rooms. Most were locked, but one door stood slightly ajar. Margaret glanced around to ensure she was alone, then pushed it open. The room was unlike anything she had expected. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, and the walls were covered with strange symbols and writings. But what caught her attention immediately was a large wooden chest in the corner, its lid slightly open. Her heart pounding, Margaret approached the chest. Margaret. Inside, she found items that made no sense in a religious community. Silk scarves, bottles of what appeared to be laudanum, and strangest of all, several leather-bound books with titles that made her blush. But beneath these items, her fingers found something else, a loose floorboard. When she pried it up, she discovered a small space containing a wrapped bundle. With trembling hands, she unwrapped it to find a journal, its pages yellowed and filled with cramped handwriting. The first entry was dated 2 years earlier. "I can no longer remain silent about what Brother Elias calls celestial ordinances. What he does to the young sisters in the name of God is an abomination. He claims that God has revealed to him that the highest form of spiritual union requires the breaking down of all earthly barriers, including those between parent and child, between adult and youth." Margaret's hands shook as she continued reading. "He has convinced the community that his desires are divine commandments. He quotes scripture about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, claiming that God sometimes requires what appears to be sin in order to test faith. The young girls are told they are chosen vessels, that their suffering purifies them for celestial glory. The entries became increasingly disturbing, detailing rituals that violated every principle of decency Margaret could imagine. The anonymous writer described how Elias had gradually introduced these practices, starting with seemingly innocent spiritual marriages and escalating to acts that the writer could barely bring themselves to describe. He has created a theology of abuse, wrapping his perversions in religious language. The community believes they are living a higher law, that their suffering is sacred. Those who question are told they lack faith, that they are being tested like Job. Margaret heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly rewrapped the journal, replacing it in its hiding place. She had just closed the chest when Sister Mary appeared in the doorway. "Sister Whitmore, what are you doing in here?" Mary's voice was sharp with panic. "I was just cleaning as instructed," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "The door was open, so I thought, this room is not to be cleaned by visitors." Mary interrupted, her face pale. "Please, you must come downstairs immediately." As they descended the stairs, Margaret noticed that Mary's hands were trembling violently. At the bottom, Mary grabbed Margaret's arm with surprising strength. "You must promise me," Mary whispered urgently, "that you will never speak of what you saw in that room. For your own safety, you must promise." "Sister Mary, I don't understand. Promise me." Mary's grip tightened, her fingernails digging into Margaret's arm. "There are things here that outsiders cannot comprehend. Brother Elias has ways of dealing with those who threaten the peace of our community." Margaret nodded, frightened by the desperation in Mary's eyes. "I promise." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew she could not keep such a promise. What she had read in that journal had confirmed her worst fears about Zion's rest. This was not a religious community, it was a prison, where Elias Cowdery used the language of faith to justify unspeakable acts. That afternoon, Margaret sought out Sister Jenkins, her fellow missionary. She found her in the garden, helping to harvest the last of the winter vegetables. "Sarah," Margaret said quietly, using her friend's first name, "we need to talk privately." Sarah looked around nervously. "Margaret, we shouldn't. The community discourages private conversations. Brother Elias says they lead to gossip and discord." "This is important," Margaret insisted. "Meet me by the creek after evening prayers, please." That night, the two women met in the shadows by the water. Margaret quickly shared what she had discovered, watching as Sarah's face grew pale in the moonlight. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, "I've noticed things too. The way some of the children flinch when adults approach, the way certain families seem to live in constant fear. But I told myself I was imagining things." "We have to do something," Margaret said. "We can't just leave these people here." "But what can we do? We're outnumbered, isolated. If we try to leave, they might stop us." "And who would believe us? Elias is connected to the Cowdery name. He has credibility in the church." Margaret had been thinking about this problem all afternoon. "There's a trading post about 2 days' ride south. If one of us could get there, we could send word to the authorities in Salt Lake City." "That's assuming we could get away without being noticed," Sarah pointed out, "and assuming the authorities would act on the word of 2 women against a respected religious leader." And their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Both women froze as a figure emerged from the shadows. Brother Samuel Hayes, one of their fellow missionaries. "Sisters," he said, his voice carrying a note of disapproval. "What are you doing out here so late?" Margaret's mind raced. How much had he heard? "We were just discussing our mission work, Brother Hayes. Sometimes it's easier to speak freely away from the community." Samuel studied them for a long moment. "Brother Elias has been asking about you, Sister Whitmore. He says the Lord has revealed that you have been struggling with doubts about the higher truths of the gospel." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. "I'm simply trying to understand the Lord's will," she replied carefully. "Brother Elias would like to speak with you privately tomorrow evening," Samuel continued. "He believes a personal revelation session will help clarify your spiritual path." After Samuel left, Margaret and Sarah looked at each other with growing alarm. "You can't be alone with him," Sarah whispered, "not after what you've discovered." "I don't think I have a choice," Margaret replied. "If I refuse, it will only confirm his suspicions." As they walked back toward their cabins, Margaret felt the weight of the journal's revelations pressing down on her. Tomorrow evening, she would be face to face with a man who had created a theology of abuse, who had convinced an entire community that his perversions were divine commandments. She only hoped she would be strong enough to maintain her facade long enough to find a way to expose the truth about Zion's rest. The next evening arrived with an early winter storm, wind howling through the settlement, and snow beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Margaret had spent the day in a state of barely controlled anxiety, going through the motions of daily life while her mind raced with plans and fears. As the community gathered for evening prayers, Elias announced that he had received a special revelation concerning their missionary guests. "The Lord has shown me that Sister Whitmore has been chosen for a sacred ordinance," he declared, his blue eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Tonight, she will receive the higher priesthood blessing that will prepare her soul for celestial glory." Margaret felt the eyes of the entire community upon her. Some faces showed what appeared to be genuine joy, as if she were receiving a great honor. Others, particularly among the younger women, showed expressions of pity and fear. "I am honored by the Lord's attention," Margaret managed to say, her voice steady despite her terror. After the communal prayers ended, Elias approached her with what appeared to be fatherly kindness. "Sister Whitmore, please come with me to the sacred chamber. The Lord has much to reveal to you tonight." Margaret followed him through the central building, past the main gathering room, and up the stairs she had climbed the day before. But instead of stopping at the room where she had found the journal, Elias led her to a door at the end of the hallway, one that had been locked during her previous visit. The room beyond was unlike anything Margaret had ever seen. Candles provided the only light, casting dancing shadows on walls covered with strange symbols and what appeared to be religious artwork depicting scenes that made her deeply uncomfortable. The air was thick with incense, and in the center of the room stood an altar-like table covered with white cloth. "Please sit," Elias said, gesturing to a chair near the altar. "We must begin with prayer and meditation to prepare your spirit for what is to come." Margaret sat, her hands folded in her lap, trying to project an image of faithful obedience while her mind searched desperately for an escape plan. The storm outside had intensified, and she could hear the wind rattling the windows. Elias began to speak in a low, hypnotic voice about spiritual preparation and the need to surrender completely to God's will. As he talked, he moved around the room, lighting more candles and preparing what he called sacred implements. "The Lord has revealed to me," he said, his back turned as he worked at a small table, "that you have been struggling with doubts about the higher laws of celestial marriage. This is natural. The natural mind cannot comprehend the ways of God. I seek only to understand the Lord's will," Margaret replied, her voice barely steady. "Understanding comes through experience," Elias said, turning to face her. In his hands, he held a small bottle and what appeared to be a piece of cloth. The ancient prophets knew that some truths can only be received through complete submission to God's chosen servants. Margaret's heart began to race as she recognized the bottle. It was similar to those she had seen in the chest upstairs, likely containing laudanum or some other drug. "Brother Elias," she said, standing slowly, "perhaps we should begin with simple prayer." I feel the need to commune with the Lord directly before. Sit down, Elias commanded, his voice suddenly sharp and authoritative. You will not question the order of these sacred ordinances. The Lord has revealed the precise manner in which this blessing must be administered. Margaret remained standing, her mind racing. The door behind her was closed, and she could hear no sounds from the rest of the building over the storm. She was completely alone with a man who had convinced himself that his perversions were divine commandments. I'm afraid I don't feel spiritually prepared, she said, taking a small step toward the door. Perhaps we could postpone. There is no postponing a revelation from God, Elias said, moving to block her path to the door. Sister Whitmore, you are being tested. Will you show the faith of Abraham, willing to sacrifice everything in obedience to the Lord? Or will you prove yourself unworthy of celestial glory? Margaret could see the madness in his eyes now, the absolute conviction that his desires were divine will. She realized with growing horror that he truly believed what he was saying, that he had so thoroughly convinced himself of his own righteousness that he saw no evil in what he was about to do. The young sisters of our community have all received this blessing, Elias continued, his voice taking on a soothing, almost hypnotic quality. They understand that what the world calls sin is actually the highest form of spiritual communion. Through complete surrender to God's chosen prophet, they have been purified and prepared for eternal glory. Margaret thought of Charity's tears, of Ruth's bruised wrists, of the haunted expressions on so many faces in the community. This man had created a theology of abuse so complete that his victims believed their suffering was sacred. I need a moment to pray, Margaret said, backing toward the window, to prepare my heart for such a sacred ordinance. Of course, Elias said, his voice gentle again, but first you must drink this blessed sacrament. It will help quiet your earthly fears and open your spirit to divine truth. He held out the bottle, and Margaret could smell the sweet, cloying scent of laudanum mixed with wine. She knew that if she drank it, she would be helpless to resist whatever he planned to do. Brother Elias, she said, trying one last desperate appeal to whatever humanity might remain in him, surely the Lord would want me to receive this blessing with a clear mind, fully conscious of the sacred nature of the ordinance. For a moment something flickered in his eyes, doubt perhaps, or a momentary recognition of the wrongness of his actions, but it passed quickly, replaced by the cold certainty of fanaticism. The Lord's ways are not man's ways, he said firmly. You will drink the sacrament, and you will receive the blessing I have been commanded to give you. Margaret realized that words would not save her. This man was beyond reason, beyond appeal to conscience or morality. She would have to save herself. As Elias stepped closer, holding out the bottle, Margaret suddenly grabbed one of the heavy candlesticks from the altar and swung it with all her strength. The brass connected with his temple, and he staggered backward, dropping the bottle, which shattered on the wooden floor. You dare strike the Lord's anointed, he roared, blood trickling down his face. You will pay for this sacrilege. But Margaret was already moving, rushing toward the door. She yanked it open and ran down the hallway, Elias's angry shouts echoing behind her. She could hear him pursuing her, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. She reached the main floor and ran toward the front door, but found it barred from the inside. Behind her, she could hear Elias descending the stairs, calling for help from other community members. Desperate, Margaret ran toward the back of the building, searching for another exit. She found a door leading to the kitchen and burst through it, startling Sister Mary, who was cleaning dishes by lamplight. Sister Whitmore, Mary gasped. What's wrong? You look. Help me, Margaret pleaded. Please, you have to help me get out of here. Mary's face went pale as she heard Elias's voice calling from the main room. You don't understand, she whispered. There's nowhere to run. The storm. You'll die out there. I'll die in here if I stay. Margaret replied. "Mary, you know what he does. You know what he's done to your own daughters." Mary's face crumpled, and for a moment, Margaret saw the broken woman beneath the facade of faithful obedience. "I can't," Mary whispered. "If I help you, the punishment for betraying the prophet is—" The kitchen door burst open and Elias appeared, his face a mask of rage. Behind him stood several men from the community, their expressions grim. "Seize her," Elias commanded. "Sister Whitmore has been overcome by evil spirits. She requires immediate spiritual intervention." As the men moved toward her, Margaret grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. "Stay back," she warned. "I know what you people really are. This isn't a religious community. It's a prison where you torture children in the name of God." "Blasphemy," Elias said coldly. "You see how the devil works through those who lack faith? She will be purified through suffering, as the Lord commands." Margaret realized that her situation was hopeless. She was outnumbered, trapped in a building full of people who believed that their leaders' perversions were divine commandments. But she would not go quietly. "The authorities will come looking for us," she said, backing toward the kitchen's rear door. "When we don't return to Nauvoo, they'll send search parties." Elias smiled, a cold expression that chilled Margaret to the bone. "By spring, you will have experienced a change of heart. You will write to your superiors, explaining that you have chosen to remain with our community, that you have found the true gospel here in Zion's rest. Many have made such choices before you." Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized the implication. She was not the first missionary to disappear into this community. How many others had been trapped here, broken and brainwashed into compliance? With a desperate cry, she threw herself against the rear door, bursting out into the howling storm. Snow and wind immediately blinded her, but she ran anyway, stumbling through the drifts toward the dark outline of the surrounding forest. Behind her, she could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit, but the storm was her ally now, hiding her tracks and muffling the sounds of her escape. She ran into the darkness, not knowing where she was going, knowing only that she had to get away from the nightmare that called itself Zion's Rest. Margaret stumbled through the storm, her thin dress and shawl providing little protection against the driving snow and bitter wind. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and she knew that exposure would kill her long before she could reach any kind of help. But the alternative, returning to face Elias Cowdery's purification, was unthinkable. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as the storm intensified. Elias would not give up easily, but even his fanatical determination had to yield to the reality of the blizzard. She hoped they would assume she had perished in the storm and call off the search until morning. Margaret's feet were already numb, and she could barely feel her hands. She needed shelter, and she needed it soon. Through the swirling snow, she glimpsed a dark shape ahead. A small cabin, apparently abandoned, sitting at the edge of the settlement's cleared land. The door was unlocked, and Margaret stumbled inside, grateful to escape the wind. The cabin was empty but dry, with a small stone fireplace and a pile of old wood stacked nearby. Her hands shook so violently from cold that it took several attempts to strike a match, but finally she managed to get a small fire started. As warmth began to return to her body, Margaret tried to think clearly about her situation. She was perhaps 20 miles from the nearest trading post, with no horse, no proper winter clothing, and no food. The storm showed no signs of abating, and even if it did, Elias would certainly organize search parties to find her. But she had one advantage: the journal hidden in the central building. If she could somehow retrieve it, she would have written evidence of the community's crimes. Without it, her word alone might not be enough to convince the authorities, especially given Elias's connection to the respected Cowdery name. As the night wore on, Margaret formulated a desperate plan. She would wait for the storm to pass, then attempt to sneak back into the settlement during the pre-dawn hours when most people would be asleep. She would retrieve the journal and then try to reach the trading post before Elias could organize a proper pursuit. It was a plan with little chance of success, but it was better than simply fleeing into the wilderness to die of exposure. The storm finally began to subside near dawn, the wind dropping to a whisper and the snow falling more gently. Margaret banked the fire and prepared to leave her temporary refuge. Her dress was still damp and she had no proper boots, but she had found an old coat hanging on a peg that provided some additional warmth. The settlement looked peaceful in the early morning light, smoke rising from chimneys as families prepared for another day. Margaret approached carefully, staying in the tree line until she could observe the central building. She saw no signs of unusual activity, no guards posted, no evidence of an ongoing search. She waited until she was certain most of the community would be at morning prayers, then crept toward the building. The front door was locked, but she remembered seeing a small window on the side that might be accessible. The window was higher than she had hoped, but by stacking some firewood, she managed to reach it. The latch was old and loose, and after several minutes of careful work, she managed to open it enough to squeeze through. She found herself in a storage room on the ground floor. Moving as quietly as possible, she made her way to the stairs leading to the upper floor. Every creak of the old wooden boards sounded impossibly loud to her ears, but she forced herself to continue. The room where she had found the journal was still unlocked. Margaret quickly located the loose floorboard and retrieved the hidden bundle. As she unwrapped it, she realized there was more than just the one journal. There were several, apparently written by different people over a period of years. She quickly scanned the contents, her horror growing with each page. The journals documented a pattern of abuse going back to the community's founding, with detailed accounts of Elias's gradual corruption of religious doctrine to justify his perversions. There were names, dates, specific incidents, enough evidence to hang Elias Cowdery and several of his accomplices. But as she prepared to leave, Margaret heard voices in the hallway outside. Her heart sank as she recognized Elias's voice, speaking to someone in urgent tones. She couldn't have gone far in that storm, he was saying. Search every building, every cabin. She may have tried to take shelter somewhere in the settlement. Margaret looked around desperately for another way out, but the room had only one door and one small window that faced the front of the building, directly into the view of anyone in the courtyard below. The voices were getting closer. Margaret quickly rewrapped the journals and looked for a hiding place. The room contained several pieces of furniture, but none large enough to conceal a person. Finally, in desperation, she climbed into the large wooden chest where she had first discovered the journals, pulling the lid down over her head. The chest was cramped and airless, and Margaret had to fight down panic as she heard the door to the room open. "Check everything," Elias commanded. "She was in this room yesterday. Sister Mary saw her here. She may have discovered something that made her flee." Margaret heard footsteps moving around the room, the sound of furniture being moved, drawers being opened. Her lungs burned as she tried to breathe silently in the confined space. "Brother Elias," came another voice, one of the men who had pursued her the night before. "The chest is locked. Break it open," Elias ordered. Margaret's heart stopped. She was trapped, with nowhere to run and no way to fight. In moments, they would discover her, and this time there would be no escape. But then another voice called from the hallway, "Brother Elias, we found tracks leading toward the old Miller cabin, fresh tracks in the snow." "Are you certain?" Elias asked. "Yes, sir. Looks like she spent the night there, then headed south toward the trading post. The tracks are maybe 2 hours old." Margaret heard Elias curse under his breath. "Gather the horses," he commanded. "We'll run her down before she can reach help, and when we find her..." His voice trailed off, but the menace in his tone was unmistakable. The footsteps retreated, and Margaret heard the door close. She waited several more minutes before daring to lift the chest lid and breathe freely again. Her ruse had worked. They had found the tracks she had made earlier and assumed she had continued south, but she knew her reprieve was temporary. When they failed to find her on the southern trail, they would return and search more thoroughly. She had to get out of the settlement immediately. Margaret climbed out of the chest and made her way back to the window. The courtyard below was empty. Everyone had apparently joined the search party or was busy with morning chores. She climbed through the window and dropped to the ground, then made her way carefully toward the edge of the settlement. But as she reached the tree line, she heard a voice behind her. "Sister Whitmore!" Margaret turned to see Sarah Jenkins standing 20 feet away, her face pale and frightened. "Sarah," Margaret whispered, "thank God. I thought you might be—" "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Margaret, but they have my sister." Margaret's blood ran cold. "What? They brought my sister here last month," Sarah continued, tears streaming down her face. "She was supposed to be visiting relatives in Salt Lake City, but they brought her here instead. They said if I cooperated, if I helped convince you to accept the higher ordinances, they would let her go." Margaret stared at her friend in horror. "Sarah, you can't trust them. They'll never let either of you go. You have to help me get these journals to the authorities." "I can't," Sarah sobbed. "You don't understand. They showed me what they do to those who betray the prophet. Margaret, please, just come back with me. Accept what they want to do." "It's the only way any of us will survive." Margaret realized with growing despair that Sarah was beyond reasoning with. Fear had broken her, just as it had broken so many others in the community. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Margaret said softly, "but I can't do that." She turned and ran into the forest, Sarah's anguished cries echoing behind her. Margaret knew that within minutes, Sarah would alert the community to her location, and the hunt would begin again. But this time, Margaret had the journals. Whatever happened to her, she was determined that the truth about Zion's rest would not die with her. Margaret ran through the forest with the desperate energy of the hunted, the precious journals clutched against her chest. Behind her, she could hear the sound of horses and shouting voices as Elias's search party closed in. The snow made tracking easy, and she knew she couldn't outrun mounted pursuers for long. But Margaret had one advantage. She knew these mountains from her childhood in a similar region. While Elias's men followed her obvious trail, she began using every trick she could remember, walking in streams to hide her tracks, doubling back on her own path, using rocky ground where footprints wouldn't show. The tactics bought her time, but not enough. As the sun reached its zenith, she heard the sound of horses much closer than before. Through the trees, she caught glimpses of riders spreading out in a search pattern, systematically covering every possible escape route. Margaret found herself trapped on a ridge overlooking a deep ravine. The drop was too steep to survive, and the riders were approaching from 3 directions. In desperation, she looked for any possible hiding place and spotted a small cave partially concealed by fallen rocks. She squeezed into the narrow opening just as the first rider appeared on the ridge above. From her hiding place, she could hear Elias's voice, cold with fury. "She's here somewhere," he said. "The tracks end at this ridge. Search every rock, every tree. She cannot escape." For hours, Margaret crouched in the cramped cave, listening to the searchers moving back and forth above her. Several times, riders passed within feet of her hiding place, but the cave's entrance was well concealed. As darkness began to fall, she heard Elias calling his men together. "We'll make camp here," he announced. "She's trapped on this ridge with nowhere to go. In the morning we'll find her, and she'll face the consequences of her rebellion against God's chosen prophet." Margaret waited until she was certain the search party had settled for the night, then carefully emerged from her hiding place. In the distance, she could see the glow of their campfire. She had to find another way off the ridge, and she had to do it in complete darkness. Moving carefully in the moonlight, Margaret worked her way along the ridge, looking for any possible descent route. Finally, she found a narrow deer trail that switched back down the steep slope. It was treacherous in the dark, but it was her only chance. The descent took most of the night, and by dawn, Margaret was exhausted, cold, and lost. But she was also free of her immediate pursuers, at least temporarily. She knew Elias would not give up easily, but the trail would be much harder to follow on the rocky slopes below the ridge. Margaret pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the journals she carried contained the only evidence that could bring justice to the victims of Zion's Rest. She had to reach civilization, no matter the cost. On the second day after her escape from the ridge, Margaret finally saw smoke rising from a chimney in the distance. As she approached, she realized it was the trading post she had been seeking, a rough collection of buildings that served travelers and trappers in the remote mountain region. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Jake Morrison, took one look at Margaret's condition and immediately offered help. She was suffering from exposure and exhaustion. Her feet were badly frostbitten and she was barely coherent. "Please," she managed to whisper as Morrison helped her inside. "I need to send word to the territorial authorities. There's a community. Terrible things. I have evidence." Morrison's wife, a practical woman named Beth, took charge of Margaret's immediate care while Jake listened to her story with growing alarm. When Margaret showed him the journals, his face went pale. "I've heard rumors about that place," he said grimly. "Travelers sometimes mention a religious community up in the valley, but nobody talks much about what goes on there. Most folks figure it's none of their business what consenting adults do in the name of religion." "These aren't consenting adults," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength as Beth's ministrations restored some of her vitality. "These are children, young women who've been brainwashed into believing that abuse is divine commandment. You have to help me get word to the authorities." Jake nodded grimly. "I'll ride to Salt Lake City myself. The territorial governor needs to see this evidence." But even as they made plans, Margaret knew that time was running out. Elias would eventually track her to the trading post, and when he did, he would stop at nothing to retrieve the journals and silence her forever. Her fears proved justified. On the third day, as Jake was preparing to leave for Salt Lake City, a group of riders appeared on the horizon. Margaret recognized Elias's tall figure at their head, and her blood ran cold. "They've found me," she told Morrison. "You have to get those journals to the authorities, no matter what happens to me." Morrison was a tough frontier man who had dealt with his share of dangerous characters, but something about Elias Cowdery and his followers unnerved him. There was a fanatical gleam in their eyes that spoke of men who believed themselves above earthly law. "Sister Whitmore," Elias called out as his party approached the trading post. "You have caused us great concern. We've come to take you home, where you can receive the spiritual healing you so desperately need." "She's not going anywhere with you," Morrison replied, stepping out of his building with a rifle in his hands. "This is my property, and she's under my protection." Elias smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Brother Morrison, you don't understand the situation. Sister Whitmore has been overcome by evil spirits. She's made wild accusations against God's chosen servants. She requires immediate spiritual intervention. The only intervention she needs is protection from you and your kind," Morrison shot back. "Now get off my land before I decide to use this rifle." For a moment, the two groups faced each other in tense silence. Margaret could see the calculation in Elias's eyes. He was weighing the cost of a violent confrontation against the risk of letting her escape with the evidence. Finally, Elias spoke again, his voice taking on a more reasonable tone. "Perhaps we can reach an accommodation. Sister Whitmore has taken certain documents that belong to our community. If she returns them, we'll consider her debt to us settled." "What documents?" Morrison asked, though Margaret had already told him about the journals. "Personal writings, family records," Elias replied smoothly. "Nothing of interest to outsiders, but precious to us for sentimental reasons." Margaret stepped forward, her voice clear and strong despite her fear. "Those documents contain evidence of crimes against children. They detail years of abuse justified as religious practice. I will not return them to this man." Elias's mask of reasonableness slipped for a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. "You speak of things you don't understand, woman. You twist sacred ordinances into worldly corruption because your mind cannot comprehend divine truth." "I understand enough," Margaret replied. "I understand that you've created a theology of abuse, that you've convinced desperate people that their suffering is sacred. But your reign of terror ends here." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses from the south. A new group of riders appeared, but these wore the uniforms of territorial marshals, led by a stern-faced man with a badge gleaming on his chest. Margaret's heart leapt with hope, but Elias showed no sign of concern. If anything, he seemed pleased by the arrival of the law enforcement officers. "Marshal Thompson," Elias called out in greeting, "how fortunate that you're here. We have a situation that requires your attention." The marshal dismounted and approached the group, his eyes taking in the tense standoff. "Mr. Cowdery," he said with a nod, "I received word that there was some kind of disturbance involving your community." Margaret felt her hope beginning to fade as she realized that Elias and the marshal were clearly acquainted. How deep did the corruption go? How many officials had been bought or convinced by Elias's claims of religious authority? "Marshal," she said quickly, "I have evidence of serious crimes committed in Mr. Cowdery's community. Children have been abused, women have been held against their will." "Now, miss," the marshal interrupted, his tone patronizing, "Mr. Cowdery here is a respected religious leader. I'm sure whatever you think you've seen can be explained." Margaret's heart sank as she realized the full scope of Elias's influence. He had cultivated relationships with local authorities, probably presenting himself as a persecuted religious minority, facing false accusations from disgruntled former members. But Jake Morrison stepped forward, his rifle still in his hands. "Marshal, I've seen the evidence this woman carries, written testimony of crimes that would turn your stomach. You need to examine it before you make any decisions." The marshal looked uncomfortable, caught between his apparent relationship with Elias and the serious nature of the accusations. "Well, I suppose I should take a look at whatever evidence you think you have." Margaret quickly retrieved the journals from their hiding place and handed them to the marshal. As he began to read, his expression changed from skepticism to horror to disgust. "Dear God," he whispered after reading several pages. "Mr. Cowdery, these documents contain detailed accounts of unspeakable acts committed against children." Elias's composure finally cracked. "Those are forgeries," he snarled. "Lies created by apostates seeking to destroy God's work. You cannot trust the word of those who have fallen away from the true faith." But the marshal was still reading, his face growing paler with each page. "These are written in different hands, by different people, over a period of years. They contain specific details, names, dates. Mr. Cowdery, I'm afraid I'm going to have to place you under arrest pending a full investigation." What followed was swift and decisive. Elias and his followers were taken into custody, and a full investigation was launched into the activities at Zion's Rest. The evidence in the journals, combined with testimony from community members who finally felt safe to speak the truth, painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even hardened law enforcement officials. Many of the community's victims were rescued and provided with assistance to rebuild their lives. The children were placed in protective custody, and efforts were made to reunite families that had been torn apart by Elias's manipulations. Elias Cowdery himself was tried and convicted on multiple charges of abuse, false imprisonment, and fraud. He maintained his innocence to the end, claiming that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Margaret returned to Nauvoo, where she submitted a detailed report to church authorities about what she had discovered. The church leadership was horrified by the revelations and took steps to ensure that such abuses could not occur again under the cover of religious authority. But Margaret's ordeal, por favor, continue girando a sua resposta. Expert logo T01. But Margaret's ordeal had left deep scars. She struggled with nightmares and anxiety for months after her return, haunted by the knowledge of what she had witnessed and the realization of how close she had come to becoming another victim. The case of Zion's Rest became a cautionary tale within the Mormon community and beyond, highlighting the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit faith for personal gain. Sarah Jenkins was eventually rescued from the community, though her sister had died during the winter, not from abuse, but from pneumonia that went untreated because Elias had forbidden contact with outside medical help. Sarah never fully recovered from the guilt of her collaboration, even though Margaret and others assured her that she had been as much a victim as anyone else. The trading post owner, Jake Morrison, became something of a local hero for his role in protecting Margaret and ensuring that the evidence reached the proper authorities. He often said in later years that it was the most important thing he had ever done, helping to bring justice to those who had suffered in silence for so long. As for the community of Zion's Rest itself, it was disbanded and the land eventually sold. The buildings fell into disrepair, and within a few years, nature began to reclaim the site where so much suffering had occurred under the guise of divine revelation. Margaret eventually married and had children of her own, but she never forgot the lessons learned in that remote mountain valley. She became an advocate for the protection of children and women in religious communities, working to ensure that the horrors she had witnessed would never be repeated. The journals that had provided the crucial evidence were preserved as part of the legal record, serving as a stark reminder that evil can flourish anywhere when good people remain silent, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who cloak their crimes in the language of righteousness. In her final years, Margaret would often tell her grandchildren that the greatest test of faith is not blind obedience to authority, but the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it means standing alone against those who claim to speak for God. The story of Zion's Rest became a dark chapter in the history of the American frontier, but also a testament to the power of one person's courage to expose the truth and bring justice to those who had been silenced by fear and manipulation. And in the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that no matter how powerful the oppressor, no matter how complete their control seems to be, the truth has a way of emerging when brave souls are willing to risk everything to bring it to light. The nightmare of Elias Cowdery's false paradise was finally over, but the memory of those who suffered and died there would serve as an eternal warning against the corruption of faith and the abuse of power in the name of divine authority.